Okay, hello everybody. It is Tara Boothby and Tony Zerbin, and we are back talking about shame. This week we had a lot of interest on our Instagram about a post on imposter syndrome. So Tony and I were like, you know what? Like, how does imposter syndrome and shame fit together? It seems relevant to notice how our vulnerable shame is impacted by a sense of imposter syndrome as well when we've been shamed. That evokes this question of imposter syndrome. So first off, like, what do we think imposter syndrome is?
Oh, I mean, this is a big conversation for us in grad school, right? Because all of us were wee little fledgling therapists at the time, starting to get our feet wet with a practicum and really running into the issue of like, what am I doing? Like, do these clients, do they know who they're sitting with? Right? And there's so much about that layer of shame in it that says, I'm not good enough for the role I'm in.
Yeah.
Right? And the thing I ran into with my supervisor at that point is they're like, well, guess what? How do you get good? You need experience. And there's really that whole sense of shame. It's like, man, I could be theoretically providing something more. My imagination says I could provide something more. And I have a really hard time sensing that I'm enough.
Yeah.
I don't even know how to be enough. I think that's an angle that I come at imposter syndrome. How would you put it?
I like that am I enough? It feels like a fatal flaw, I think, for most people. I remember years ago, Kent Hoffman, Circle of Security originator,
Mm-hmm.
At points people feel like a failure or this imposter syndrome. Some people just have known it their whole lives and they're a little bit more honest about it. And we have a different sort of attachment orientation to this experience of, am I good enough?
Mm-hmm.
Am I good enough? And then I see all my failures. I feel like I'll never measure up. And I'm always seeking somebody else to help me say I'm okay.
Yeah.
Am I good enough? So I work hard, set unrealistic expectations I can never attain. And so I always wonder if I ever good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Or some variety of a push and pull of like overcompensating and crumbling and overcompensating, and these ways that really, I would say, imposter syndrome is shame.
Shame. It gets us out of our sense of ourself.
Yes.
Right. It's interesting. As I think about it, in my body dynamic training, the way I think we would break it down is that our sense of our center, that deep core in us, our sense of ourself is something that we can work on. And then our sense of how we fill up our roles, how we enter into a sense of self-esteem, and how we can really center even there as well is one of the big challenges, because a lot of us can take on a role, but the me doesn't show up in the role the same kind of way. And I think when we don't have a sense of ourselves in our role, it's like, okay, I'm playing a role, but who's playing this role? Because it doesn't feel like it's me.
Yeah.
And there's that sense of I'm out of touch with something really significant in myself, and that feels really awful. I'm missing a piece of me when I'm in this role.
I like that. And I think sometimes it's just like we haven't made friends with being uncomfortable. It can be that simple. That there's things that I'm not good at, Tony's not good at. And so when I'm uncomfortable, I have to like figure out how to do something in a way that's not my own. Mm-hmm. And still make peace with it. Sometimes we have to do uncomfortable things.
Yeah.
I also think that, excuse me, when I think of imposter syndrome, it seems so normal with adolescent angst.
Yeah.
Like there's a space in our life where we developmentally go through time that we're like, who am I?
Yeah.
Do I fit in? Does everybody know that I'm like this insecure basket case? So I think, and for a lot of people, we start to hinge into imposter syndrome. Maybe in our adolescence, we start to create some habits. But with what Tony's saying and what I believe, is for some reason we know our own humanity, so we know our own flawedness.
Yeah.
And then we're all questioning if it's safe to show other people our flaws.
Well, and something that gets me curious about this too, that might be unique, especially at this point in history, is it's never been more common and more possible for us to have a virtual self.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I'm a gamer. I've played video games for probably most of my life. I have a lot of fun creating virtual selves. But there's this sense, even on Facebook, on TikTok, that I'm showing my best face all the time. And I'm allowing people to connect with my virtual self. But there again, that's very close to being a role.
Yeah.
And if our primary mode of interacting with the world is through a virtual self, the good old shame dialogue that shows up is this: they wouldn't love me if they saw the real me. They wouldn't respect me if they saw the real me. They don't know the real me, and I can't let them.
Yeah, it could really inform that. So the social media online presence can perpetuate this sense of false self. And then it goes back to when I'm so used to fine-tuning my presentation in one avenue, be it online or professionally, then imposter syndrome is going to show up in other places where I feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And we, especially coming out of the past couple of years, we're all a bunch of social awkward individuals. So of course we feel uncomfortable, and we have to renegotiate our boundaries and what worked. Yeah. What is safe to share, what is unsafe. Yeah. Being aware of what it feels like in our body when our attachment system is activated, or, body dynamics is all about what the body's feeling, where it's feeling, and how that's connected into our trauma stories. And how to help you feel more uncomfortable stuff without checking out, so that you can get through the uncomfort to something that integrates on the other side. Yeah. Yeah. So there's imposter syndrome is normal. And it shows up in uncomfortable times. It shows up in times where we're being challenged to notice just our discomfort, or times where we are being challenged to grow. Yeah. Or not grow, or not be challenged. I mean, if we choose not to grow and not be challenged, then that gets us stuck in this imposter syndrome or unaware of it. Yeah. Well, and it's a beautiful invitation, because it's through the shame of imposter syndrome that on the other side, there's the opportunity for us to actually be ourselves in our roles. Yeah. The way Tony does therapy is going to be different than the way Tara does therapy. Yeah. And it's important that my clients know that. Yeah. Because they can get the Tony experience, and there's very likely going to be a point where they've had the Tony experience and they might need a different experience. Yeah. And maybe then at that point they need the Tara experience. Yeah, and I think just the ebbs and flows of why we're drawn into one friendship at one time with one need, and why we're drawn into another friendship at one time with a different need. Yeah. But I see, like, we're all growing, and I sort of see this personal growth. This is how I'll describe it, is like we're climbing, and when you get closer to the peak, it feels more acute. It's at the top of the mountain. It's a more strict climb. We get to the top, and there's kind of this lull of a hot tub or a hot pool, and then we're gonna start going again. Yeah. But accepting the growth, and that when we're really about to learn, it becomes much more uncomfortable and much more acute growth. Yeah. And then we do get a bit of a rest, and then we're gonna go off up a hill again. Yeah. We need grace for the fact of it. It's like, God grant me. Well, I always say, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, change the things I can, but that's not what I meant to say. What I meant to say was, similar school of thought, that I can accept myself for the things that I didn't know when I didn't know them. Yeah. And what is beautiful is this, like, as I grow and as I accept feeling like an imposter, I'm better to look back at younger parts of myself and say, I just didn't know what I didn't know. I was speaking from a less informed place. Well, and it's funny because one of the things that shows up in body dynamic developmental theory
is at the same age we really start to get a sense of shame associated with our actions, where we really begin to learn how to grapple with shame. It's the same age that we also start stepping into roles. We start navigating our sense of our power and our agency in this world. And where kids often really grapple with this idea of, I should know it without having to learn it.
Yeah.
I should know how to do this already. Don't help me. I should know it already.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, that's a developmental task, to be able to sit with our shame long enough to learn.
Yeah.
And not everybody's good at doing that, but not everybody's also allowed to not everybody's shame is always welcome at the table. Right?
Yes.
And if it's not welcome at the table, we don't actually have a lot of space to learn.
Yeah. And what did our parents do with our shame? So this is from an attachment perspective. One of the things we're trying to understand is what happened in your home when shame showed up.
Yeah.
You know, was mom's shame allowed? Was dad's shame allowed? Was yours? Were siblings? Because that's it too. Our kids feel shame. And I like what you're saying about the school age children, because it's interesting to consider how young we get competitive and we're aware of our peers. So my 5-year-old, he went to this school field trip and they were learning some bike safety and road safety. It was an awesome field trip. And I was so pumped for when he came home. He comes home, I'm like, how was it? It's amazing. It looks so cool. And he's like, starts crying. He's like, it's terrible. I was terrible. I was terrible. All my friends, all the kids knew what they were doing. I was bad. And I'm like, what? Like, that is, you just were riding little quads around this mini streets. Like, that's so cool.
Yeah.
But so that comparison, we do this alternate comparison level. We look to see how are our peers doing.
Yeah.
And if they're doing a little better than us, shame.
So that brings us back to social media. And it brings us back also to one of my favorite quotes of the moment that I'm using in a lot of sessions, because there's so much to unpack from it. But when it comes to comparison and shame and imposter syndrome and social media, the quote is, most of the time, the world is flat.
Yeah.
Right? And to unpack that a little bit, because it's such a like smash you over the head kind of quote, it's, in our experience, most of the time, the world is flat. We know, we've been taught that it's round. Most of us haven't really had much of an opportunity to see that it's round. And in our daily experience, we treat the world as if it is flat. Right? The objective truth is that it's round, but in our experience, it's flat. Social media, the objective truth is most people really struggle with shame. A lot of people, if not most, really struggle with imposter syndrome. But we experience their lives as these wonderfully curated social media streams. So most of the time we experience everybody else as knowing what they're doing.
Yeah.
And we only experience ourselves as the ones that have no clue what's going on.
That's interesting too, when we compare like the world is flat versus what I'm saying about this learning curve. And if I, again, the alternate comparison level, if I just think, look at all those great people in rural or whatever, Alberta, flat Alberta. It's flat people. And it's like, everybody's just living their flat lives and they're doing so amazing. And I have to keep doing this. This is it though. That climbing and that creating dimension and accepting dimension, being uncomfortable with dimension in our lives, accepting that growth curve and having grace to look back on our less informed place. Also knowing what Brene Brown, Atlas of the Heart, this was just like such a freeing sentiment that I read. She says, without fail, what we cannot control is other people's perceptions. What people perceive of us is completely out of our control.
Absolutely.
So if people know how hard we're working, or if people know we're doing our best, or trust our positive intentionality, or see us as successful, or see us as all these great things that of course we want to be admired. That's healthy and normal. longing to be delighted in is an attachment need.
Yeah.
That is something hardwired in us to yearn to be delighted in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and that fits with imposter syndrome, and that fits with when we see a lack of delight or admiration, we can experience it as shame, and sometimes it is. Sometimes people are just really shaming us.
Yeah.
You know, or giving us a rolled eye or whatever. That's sort of like whatever people are doing.
It tells you a lot about where they're at, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but then in that moment, it's like, I don't want, you know.
Totally. And there's a great quote that goes along the lines of, it's a Chinese proverb actually, that a straight stick doesn't need to fear a crooked shadow. Mm-hmm. It's not that other people won't see crooked shadows, but if you're a straight stick, then at the end of the day, that sorts itself out. People get to see that. They get to test you out where you're at.
Yeah.
Right?
It's interesting when I hear that too. Oh no, Tony and I are going to do something philosophical. I'm just warning you. Is then I'm like, there's the only way that there's a crooked shadow is if there's a crooked stick. And so I'm like, if how our imprint on the world, and it's multidimensional always, we always leave a crooked shadow. The straight stick does not have to fear a crooked shadow because it can't.
Right. Yeah.
But you can say that either way, right? Like there's this thing of like, just knowing who you are is your humanity is your humanity.
Yeah.
And each one of us has this flawed, beautiful experience.
Well, and with most proverbs, it's true in one sense, and it's also false in one sense. So you don't need to fear a crooked shadow if your orientation is looking at yourself. Others can look at you and they can see something crooked. But that's actually a little bit more about them. Mm-hmm. So the proverb's true in the sense that if you look at yourself, then you don't need to worry the same kind of way if you know your intentions.
And if you embrace, like I would say, like William Paul Young will say, no secrets. Mm-hmm. Like what helps with imposter syndrome is we all have a crooked shadow, you know, and so yeah, it's scary if we don't integrate it into who we are.
Yeah.
If I can love and accept myself, flaws and all, and I can be honest with myself about that and more honest with the people around me, safe people around me.
Yeah.
Then I can know my spiritual truth, my pure of heartness.
Exactly. And I mean, what that looks like functionally, practically, clinically is saying, do I have the courage to make some space to experience my own shame?
Yeah. Because
if I don't want any secrets, I'm going to bear some shame. But if I can make space for the shame, it's not a little pressure cooker. I've got physically space to hold my emotion because my whole body is a place to hold emotion.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it's just when we are living in the fullness of who we are, all of our struggles, all of our natural, developmental, neurological, biological DNA of being human, fears and worries, because it's just natural. We look at other people and we worry about who we are.
Yeah.
So if we can embrace that, then we can integrate it in. Mm-hmm. It's not being an imposter to be human.
No, totally. And thinking about it and kind of just trying to hold all this, another thing that comes up for me about imposter syndrome is that for a lot of people, you can have a really crappy growing up experience at home. And then we come into school and we get kind of a second chance when we come to school, because then we can have peers that actually give us safer connection than we might have at home. We can have teachers and coaches that might give us safer connection than we have at home. And the way we show up in school is often through our performance. So we get good marks on our tests. We do good on our sports teams. And sometimes for people, that might be the first real validation they get.
Yeah.
And there's this sense that the self that develops at home before school, the first 5 years of life, right, might have a really rocky start, but the layers on top can be a place of real resilience. But that might also be a place that shows up, for some people at least, as imposter syndrome, as saying, I'm seen best when I'm validated for my performance.
Yeah.
I don't have a good sense of what it feels like to be seen for something other than my performance.
Well, I like people's perception of me when I'm doing well.
Yeah. And I mean, therapeutically, the challenge is how do I help my client get a sense that they are worthy and lovable and amazing no matter how they perform?
So it's interesting too, when we're thinking about, because psychologists, we do talk about imposter syndrome for ourselves often.
Yeah.
When people come into us, when people come into your life, whether you're a therapist or not, and they're being vulnerable with their imperfections.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is, of course, we're going to feel some level of imposter syndrome or touch our own shame.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it's like, how are we, it's such a sacred space when people are vulnerable.
Exactly.
And it's also like, the truth is that we have nothing to hide, and we can be vulnerable with our flaws in safe relationship spaces.
Yeah.
So I think imposter syndrome too can just, sometimes it's that we're not achieving, or we're trying to overdo life in a way to hide who we are. Sometimes if we're letting go of that, the other piece is to know that when we're being vulnerable and human, we're gonna hit other people's imposter syndrome.
Yep. And if we're tuned in, there might be some countertransference even. It's like, shit, they're feeling shame, and suddenly I'm feeling shame. And do they see my shame?
Oh,
Is it mine? Is it theirs? I mean, yeah, that's the gritty. Because there can be a lot of imposter syndrome for therapists. It's like, am I doing the therapy well?
It's interesting too, because it's like, I think imposter syndrome is more usually self-inflicted. However, it's almost always in relationship.
Absolutely.
It's interesting.
Well, I mean, if I were to be even a little bit vulnerable about my experience of it and doing this work, there was a really long time where I questioned even coming into the profession, because I'm sitting there, I'm going like, what do I do? What am I doing? How do I justify the value of what I'm doing? Because if I do something like a trade, I really respect so many of my friends in the trades. They do something and they have product to show for it at the end of the day. You can walk away physically if you're a carpenter or a welder or something. You can walk away physically. You did something.
Yeah.
It's harder to really get a sense of that, at least initially, in this therapeutic work. Right? And my big grappling was like, how do I make sense of the value of therapy? But then over the course of doing this work, what's integrated for me is I look back and I say, there's people that have told me that I made a difference between them actually even being here today or not. There's relationships where people are still together and they might have gone through a really costly divorce otherwise. Not everyone, right? But there's people who are able to connect with their parents better. And it's like, okay, how do you put a dollar value on that?
Yeah.
And then I sit in the mystery of that and I say, okay, there's a value here and I'm mixed up in it somehow. I play a little part of it maybe, but.
Yeah. And it's when we have these really meaningful jobs, like I hope people pursue and find a job that evokes meaning in their life. But like jobs, psychology, social workers, doctors, nurses, financial advisors, these people, there's all these really beautiful jobs where teachers has to grapple with, why do I have the privilege of offering corrective experience? Because, there's all these things we do, But then underneath it is these are a lot of attachment experiences. We don't really, I don't know, somebody smarter might know how to quantify an attachment when an attachment experience is corrective. It's qualifying. It's this like, oh, I know something happened there because I'm allowing myself to see it.
Yeah.
So imposter syndrome and shame rooted in our experiences of just being with people and how we've learned to cope with feeling inadequate, rooted in our experience of how shame was handled in our home, what we were taught about shame, people's criticisms of us, traumas, all sorts of things. There's lots of layers.
Yeah. How do we integrate shame while performing a role? And how do we put ourselves into our role?
Yeah. And it's a human theme for us to be troubled, worried by other people's perceptions of us. It's very freeing to know they're out of our control. And it's very natural to just sort of do the alternate comparison, to want to see how we're doing compared to others and feel a little bit better.
Absolutely.
And then you're going to feel like a failure. If you're taking risks, if you're being uncomfortable, you're going to feel uncomfortable.
And it's good to make space for that discomfort because it's on the other side of it.
Yeah.
That learning happens.
Definitely.
It's through it, learning happens. And if you can't sit with the shame of imposter syndrome, if it's too much, then how do you ever integrate?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And eventually it is too much. And the more we learn to open up about it, the more we learn to ask for help with it, the more we can make friends with our fear, our shame, our imposter syndrome. It all fits together.
Yeah, exactly. Like if a client were to come to me and say, you know what, maybe you don't got space for all of that shame, but if we could just make space for 15% of it, 10% of it, and try it out and see what it's like. Allow yourself to feel just 10% of that shame with me.
Yeah.
You can close your eyes and you can take a peek, see if I'm still there with you.
Yeah.
Because I need you to actually be able to experience the corrective emotional experience that you're in your shame and I'm with you.
Yeah.
You just admitted how you're terrified to be in your job or your role. And I'm with you.
Yeah.
Right.
Because it's like we start with 15 or 5 or whatever, and then we go up to 10 or 20, and then we go up to, and that's what I do.
Yeah.
When he does, that's what people do when we're sort of making hello imposter syndrome.
Yep.
Let's talk about what's going on.
And the skill that happens in the session, if you learn how to hold 15% in session, so many of my clients come back to me a week or two later and say, so we did 15% in session and now I'm sitting with 70 because I kept doing the work between just automatically. We opened the door and you can't help but walk through it once the door's open.
Yeah, because it's when we don't know what's on the other side of a closed door, it's a lot harder than when we open it up and we see.
Together in connection, safe connection.
Together in safe connection. Awesome. Yeah. Anything else before we wind things down?
No, you gave me the nugget and I'm like, where are we going to go with this? And this was lovely.
I think it was good. Because when I put that post up and I thought it was good, but I'm like, I want to think about this more and have a more embodied experience of my own theory of imposter syndrome. So it's nice to just riff with you, Tony, and it's fun.
Always.
Okay.
Always.
Bye.
Bye.